So I ask you to start thinking about pitching your story, and so I want to be prepared for that, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I want to do a last piece of sort of the story structure, so that when Hillary comes Monday, we'll be ready to start talking about pitching your story. But I want to pick up on this whole thing about the technology. So we've created a lot of ways to share information with people these days. So as storytellers, as journalists, as whatever it is we do, however we tell our stories, there are lots of platforms on which we do that. So the notion of what is a journalist in the 21st century is very different than it was when I started journalism school more than 40 years ago. So when I became a journalist, so I started journalism school in 1974, so 41 years ago. So when I went to journalism school, the great technological advent of the time was something called a CRT, which was a computer. So journalists until that time had basically written stories on typewriters, and they used to do the old typeset. They hand them off to somebody, they would set the type, and then somebody would, they had the old letterpresses. And that's how they did the stories. Well, of course, if you were around the world or in a different place and time, how do you suppose if a reporter who covered World War II or a reporter who covered the civil rights movement in Mississippi for the New York Times or something like that, how do you suppose they got their stories back to their home news organizations? How do you suppose they got them back? They would pick up the telephone and they would call and they would read the story over the phone, and somebody would take it by dictation. That's how they did it. And frankly, even when I came into the business, they were just starting to introduce computers. So I came into the business, but by the time I got out of college and I got my first job, if you were out remotely on a story, just out somewhere, there were no cell phones. So you had to go find a payphone somewhere, and you had to write your story out longhand. Then you had to go find a payphone somewhere and call your office, collect, and then dictate your story to somebody over a telephone. That's how you did it. So I started a job at a newspaper in 1978, and in some point in 1979, there was a big hurricane that hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast and the Gulf Coast of Alabama. So it came in through the Gulf of Mexico, and it was a big storm. So I went off to cover the hurricane. And in those days, it was that same thing. You wrote your story, you picked up the telephone, and you called. So I say that to say this, and pick up on what Sasha said. So the lack of technology sometimes creates opportunities for us in innovation. That's how we become innovative. So if you find that you need to tell a story, then the question becomes, if I can't not do it in one way, what are other ways in which I can? And you always sort of have to be prepared for that. And we've gotten so dependent on technology sometimes. You always have to take into consideration the possibility that your technology may fail, because it does. So we still have to know how to do journalism in old-fashioned ways. We still have to know how to tell stories in old-fashioned ways, so that when the technology fails us, then we know how to get our stories out. So nowadays, at the Associated Press, they send a reporter out. They send them out with a cell phone. They send them out with a laptop. And as long as you can get a cell phone signal, you can transmit a story. You can transmit stories and photos from practically anywhere. Because if you're in a country like the United States, there's a cell phone tower somewhere. So all you got to do is get a decent enough cell phone signal, and you can transmit a story. So, but there are times that the technology fails. The power goes out. If you're covering a hurricane or a storm or an earthquake or anything like that, there's no electricity. So if there's no electricity, you cannot. There are no cell phone towers. So you have to learn to get around those things. So that I wanted to pick up on that and say, if there are things that you don't have, that you wish you had, then strive toward getting those tools. But in the meantime, learn how to reach your audiences and learn how to tell your stories to those audiences anyway. Because you can do it. People do it every day. People have been doing it for years. We were telling stories long before there were computers to tell them on. So what I want to do And I'm going to go ahead and let you, because you've been here, but I'm going to go ahead and let you take a break. But what I want to do, we've been talking about story structure, and so we've gotten to a point where there was one element that I really wanted to talk to you about, and that is that's quotes, because one of the most important elements of a story is the quotes that you include in it. You are, I've said you're the storyteller. And it is your voice that the reader hears. But you are sharing other people's stories. And there are ways in which we do that. So depending on the situation, a quote becomes an important device for telling your story. Because it adds voice to your story. It adds something to your story that you could not otherwise have. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about. And we'll start the conversation about the purpose of quotes, how to use them in stories, what's a good quote, what's a not so good quote. But we go out every day, and one of the things we tend to think of is you interview people. Journalists interview people. So if you go back to our little story about the mugging on the street corner, and you would go and interview people and say what happened. If you would look for eyewitnesses and say what happened. And then you would go to the police and you would say, what happened? And then you might call some family members of the woman who was injured or something like that, and you would say, how is she doing? Does she know what? And sometimes we interview the victims of crimes and natural disasters and things themselves, which can be very difficult. So a lot of times when there are natural disasters, we go in and we ask people, how are you coping? How are you, So in the story about the refugee, that story is largely told through a combination of the writer's eyes and senses and the refugees. So the writer is the person in that story who sets up time and place, creates an atmosphere, who tells you what the sky looks like, and then gives you a real sense of the person who is the subject of his story. If you remember, he talked about his anxiousness and how he was waiting for nightfall to make a dash for the border. So your role in a situation like that becomes you are the storyteller, but the way you start to tell details of that story are through the eyes of other people. So you set the scene, you set the time, the place, and what I've talked about before, you give people something that puts them in that time and place. If you were here, you would describe the room. How tall is the ceiling? What are the floors like? What colors are the walls? How warm is the room? How well does sound carry? And those all seem like minute details that you probably ordinarily would not pay a lot of attention to. But your job is to look for small details, because that's the only, particularly if you are a writer, because that's the only way that you can really put people in the time and place that you are. And even if you are a broadcast journalist, or if you're a filmmaker, there are all these things that you have to explain to your readers. And so you create that context. And then for the parts of the story that you are sharing about those people, that's what you use quotes for. So you're the storyteller, you set the time and the place, and you use quotes to tell the story. ArtNews versus features, we talked about the importance of curiosity and observation. We talked about who, what, when, where, why, and how. And I want to elaborate on one thing about that in a moment. We talked about focus and perspective. We talked about the inverted pyramid and the cocktail glass style of writings. We talked about different types of leads, the summary lead, feature lead, particularly the anecdotal lead. We talked about nut graphs, and we talked about supporting the lead. So tonight we're going to talk about effective use of quotes in stories. And I really want to talk about how to use them more than anything else, because as we go along, we'll work with you on really how to incorporate them into your story to make sure that you're doing the right thing. But before we do that, I want to back up real quickly, because someone asked me a question last night. Because when we're talking about, so we talked about the who, what, when, where, why, and how, and then we got to this point where we're talking about adding perspective in stories and focus and things like that. And so one of the things I said is you want to tell readers why this is an important story to them. And so a couple of you I know were somewhat confused because I posed the question why again, okay? So when we start talking about structuring a basic news story, the idea of who, what, when, where, why, that particular why is the question of why did this happen? And it's a question that you were trying to answer in your story. Why did this happen? You know, if there were heavy rains and there was a mudslide, why did this happen? So let's say there was a mudslide, it destroyed some homes, and that's what you're talking about. You know, farmers lost their homes. That's the who, the what. The farmers, they lost their homes. When? After the storm. Where? You know, at the foot of the mountain. Why? Because heavy rains loosened the soil. That's the why. So the question of why in terms of perspective is a question of why is this an important, why is this important to your readers? And that's what you're trying to convey to people, a sense of there is something about this story that's important to you. But the why is a part of the who, what, when, where, why, how, is you trying to answer the question of why did this happen, okay? So I wanted to make that clear because someone didn't ask me about it. The other thing is that I made a couple of notes to myself, and I think this is a really important thing because a lot of you are doing all three classes, and what you are spending time there talking about is visuals, and then we come in here and we talk about writing. So one of the things I talked to you a lot about last night when we were talking about supporting your lead, and I started off began with earlier tonight, is this whole idea of your role as a journalist is to paint a picture. So painting a picture for someone, you know, creating a scene, creating a setting for them is very visual. So what I like to, and this is what I've left out that I wanted to bring up. So what I like to say to people, the way you create a visual is to say, if I took a series of photographs, what would they look like? Okay? So if you were covering a story, whether it's a news conference or a meeting or some crime or a tragedy or you're writing a feature about something that's really beautiful, you know, you ask yourself, if I could photograph, and most times you will, but if I could photograph this, what would the photograph look like? And so you're not trying to explain to people what's in the photographs. You're trying to set a scene for them that really, if they close their eyes, they could see it, they could feel it, they could smell it. That's what you want to do. So storytelling is very visual. So think in terms of the visuals, and most of the time, hopefully, you will be working with photographers or videographers who are shooting, and you have to think in terms of telling a complementary story. You don't necessarily want to tell the same story, because when you put different elements of a story together, let's say you're writing a story for online, okay, and it has text, it has writing, it has still photographs, it has audio clips, and it has video. Every one of those things should tell a complete story, but they should tell different segments of it. So you want to tell a complementary story, but you also want to make sure that that your stories work together. So think visually and make sure that you can put people in a place. So from this whole idea of supporting the lead in your story, the next piece of that is using quotes in your story. So I want to start with the question of what makes a good quote. That's what I was going to, what makes a good quote? The purpose of a quote is to back up your lead or to substantiate information in your story. It does one of those two things. And they can often come fairly high in the story, but sometimes we'll wait, a few paragraphs in before we do that. Because we want to introduce, we want to introduce people, we want to tell them what happened, and then we want to substantiate it, we want to reinforce it by using quotes, by using the words of someone else, okay? So quotes are a way of sort of adding life to your stories. And one of the things I've said all week is that all journalism is about humans. It's about people. So this is a way of sort of adding another human element to your story, another people element to your story. It adds life to your story. So the thing you don't want to do is use bad quotes. And so that's what we're going to talk about is what's the difference between a good quote and a bad quote and how you use it. So the first thing is when you put a quote in your story, it should not directly repeat something that you have already said. And a lot of writers make that mistake. You know, they'll write a story that says that they'll say one thing, and then they come back with a quote that says pretty much exactly the same thing. So let's think in terms of our story about the woman who was mugged on the street corner. And let's say that we've done some additional reporting. The police are investigating. There was a police lieutenant out, and he or she was investigating the scene, and we went over to talk to the lead investigator at the scene. So you were going to put a quote on your story, and one of the things you have found out while interviewing is that this police lieutenant said that there has been a long time since they've had any. It's a safe area. There's been a long time since they had any incident like this. So you might write into your story a sentence that said, "Police said this is the first violent crime at this bus stop in more than 5 years." Okay, so now you want to add a quote that reinforces, that adds life, that supports what you've written there. Now here's a mistake that a lot of writers make. So remember that paragraph said, "Police said this is the first violent crime at this bus stop in more than 5 years." So you come back with a quote that says, "We have not had a violent crime at this bus stop in more than 5 years," Police Sergeant Mary Smith said. So the problem you see what the problem with that is that you haven't told the reader anything new. Every time you write a sentence in your story, you should be moving your story forward. You should be telling your reader something that they didn't previously know. So all you're doing is repeating here. So if this police sergeant said something as maybe this, we consider this one of the safest bus stops in the city, Sergeant Mary Smith said. That's something you could add. So you've already said, police said this is the first violent crime at this bus stop in more than 5 years. And then you have your quote. We consider this one of the safest bus stops in the city, Sergeant Mary Smith said. That's how you move your story forward, because that quote gives your readers something they have. So and when I say quotes, if you're a broadcast journalist, the same is true if you're using a soundbite. If you're a radio journalist, if you're a television journalist, if you are doing a documentary film, if lots of documentary films have the narrations, right? So if you're narrating your film, you don't want to say something in your film and then have someone who you're interviewing in your film come back and effectively say what you said. You want to continuously move your story forward. So quotes allow your readers, your listeners, your viewers to hear from people who are interesting, knowledgeable, and who have perspective on what you are writing about, or people who wield some sort of influence. So people who are interesting, knowledgeable, have perspective, or wield influence. So let's say you were covering something about politics, and you're writing about a new piece of legislation or a new regulation or a new law or something or new tax or they have these protests going on in South Africa over tuition hikes, and people from the government are starting to talk about that. So if you get somebody who has some influence, that's why you want to ask for people who have influence. They have to be someone who actually can add something to your story. So are they interesting? If you're writing a feature story, you really want somebody who can sort of liven your story up. Are they interesting? What do they add to your story? And so that's the first thing is you want to say, what does this person add to my story? So one of what I think is a basic rule for determining what's a good quote. So much of the time we go in, and I actually recommend it, if you are doing an interview, a sit-down interview with somebody, to actually take a recorder in and record it. And the reason being is that it just reinforces what you've done. Now, as a reporter, what I would do is take a tape recorder, and then I'd take the best notes that I could, and I would use the tape recorder only if I wanted to use a quote and I couldn't find the full quote in my notes. So one of the worst things you can do as a journalist is to take a tape recorder and put the tape recorder down and sit there and take no notes, especially if you are a writer. Now, generally speaking, if you are a television journalist, even if you're a television journalist, you need to take some notes. If you are interviewing somebody for a documentary film, you need to take some notes. So don't simply rely on your recording. So this is particularly true for print journalists, for people who work for newspapers and online, because it still happens. I've seen reporters get back to the office, they've not taken one note, and they get back to the office and there's no audio on their tape, on their recorder. Can you imagine that? But the other thing is that if you have audio, if you have managed to record the whole interview, then you have to go back and transcribe the whole interview if you have not taken any notes. So if you take notes, you sort of, you can't always get everything in because you're trying to pay attention, you're trying to ask questions, you're trying to take everything in, and you're trying to write it down. It's a lot to do. So sometimes you'll hear something and you'll start to write a quote and you can't get it all, you can't write it all the way out. That's what you want to use your recorder for. So a basic rule for deciding what is a good quote is the question of, can I remember it without looking back at my notes? Okay? So when you walk away from an interview and you're thinking about what this person said, what this person told you, what jumps out at you? What can I remember? And those things that you can remember, if you can remember that they said it, it's not an absolute, but if you can remember that they said it, then it is probably a good quote. Because that's what you want, is something that your readers, your listeners, your viewers are going to walk away and it's going to stick in their mind. So that's it. So interview people who are interesting, knowledgeable, who have perspective, and who wield influence, because they're the people who are going to broaden your story and make something out of it. So here's some guidelines for writing effective quotes. And I think what I may do, and I probably should have done, is what I'll do is bring you a handout Monday, have a handout for you Monday with these things in it. Is the quote interesting and informative? Is there nothing? If you're better to leave a quote out of a story than put a bland quote in a story, because people say, well, it doesn't say anything. Is it interesting and informative? Can the quote back up your lead or your nut graph, or does it add some supporting information to your story? If it doesn't do one of those things, then leave it out. Does it back up your lead or your nut graph, or does it add some interesting or supporting information, some supporting information to your story? It really needs to fit your story. It needs to further your story. Does your quote repeat somebody already in your story? If it does, don't use it. Okay? Again, we want to keep moving our story forward. Because if you're sitting telling a story to a friend, you don't tend to backtrack. You keep moving your story forward. And so the quotes are a device to help you bring these elements into your story. So you want to do the same thing. You want to keep moving your story forward. Does the quote say something you haven't said already, or add something to what you already have? That's what you're looking for. Does it say something you haven't said already? Does the quote advance the story? Does it move it forward by adding emotion, context, perspective, depth, interest, or some kind of new information? So does it move your story forward? That's what we want to do. Adding emotion. How are people feeling? Oh my God, I was standing on the street corner and I was horrified when I saw that guy snatch that woman's purse. That's emotion. I saw these people over here, and I walked over here just because I wanted to know what was going on, interest. Or they say, well, people are saying there were 3 guys. I actually saw another one running the other way. So some new information. And here's an important thing. So one of the worst things journalists feel like I've got a quote, and I want to quote this person, and I should quote this person. So here's a quote that provides some information that I really need in my story. Except the quote's not very good, and lots of journalists have a tendency to go ahead and put that quote in there anyway. So if the quote isn't very good, but you need the information, what do you do? Anybody? What do you do if the quote? Yes. Paraphrase. So you've got somebody who they've told you something that you need to know, something that you need to tell your readers, your listeners, your viewers, something that's important. It fits all the other criteria that we've talked about. You need this in your story to make your story better, to move your story forward. Except you're reading the quote and you think, this isn't very good. This person is not very well spoken. They're not very articulate. So what you do is you paraphrase. There are lots of times where if you've read a story and you thought, well, this quote doesn't say anything, that's because the writer would have been better saying it in their own words. So you know what the intent of the person was. And one of the things you want to do when you paraphrase somebody is stay true to what they are saying. So if you have someone saying, this is the safest neighborhood, in the city. And you didn't think the quote was very good, but you want to make sure you stick closely to what the intent of the speaker was. That's very important. So here you avoid direct quotes when they're boring, but here's when you do use quotes. One other thing. So you avoid direct quotes when they're boring. And there's one other time that you avoid quotes. It's when the facts are indisputable. And this is one of my biggest complaints. And I say this all the time. Journalists, certainly American journalists, have gotten very timid about not attributing things. They want to attribute everything. And so I joke sometimes and complain that I feel sometimes if journalists were saying the sun is shining, they would want to attribute it to a meteorologist. Okay? There are things that, and somebody talked about this and asked about this in class a couple of nights ago. Your own powers of observation are important in the story. And if you can state something that is indisputable, then there's no need in quoting someone else. If you know that the color is red, that the sun is shining, that it was storming, that it was 9 o'clock, that there was this stench in the air, that there was a very fragrant smell in the air, that there was a crowd that could be estimated at about 300 people standing around. These kinds of things that nobody's going to argue with. Now, if it's a crowd of 1 million people, you might want to ask somebody. But if there's 20 people standing there, because you can count 20 people. So, if you are covering a football game and a fight breaks out and the stadium erupts, I'm sure that never happens. But the crowd gets wild. You can say that because you saw it, you witnessed it with your own eyes. So when you are in a place, in a setting, and you're reporting about something that's there, and this is true even if you're writing a feature story. I've talked about this chicken farm or going out, interviewing people, doing things, kind of everyday things. If you were in that time and place, your powers of observation are important to your audience. And your audience is dependent on you as a storyteller to use your own powers of observation and your own perspectives. So never use quotes for facts that are not in dispute, that are indisputable. So when you're interviewing people, and again, there will always be people who are not very well spoken, and you want to avoid quotes that are not clearly worded. and that are not easy to understand. And so here's one thing. So most reporters cover a beat, right? And so most reporters cover what's called a beat. So a beat is where you are assigned to cover a topic or a subject matter or an area, something like that. You cover education, or you cover healthcare, or you cover city government, or you cover state government, or you cover the federal government, or you cover the president, or something like that. So you cover finance, things that's a beat. So if I cover healthcare, or if I cover science and medicine, that's a beat. So there's the upside of reporters covering a beat is that it allows you to get to know the people who make a difference in that subject matter. So if it's someone who covers education, you get to know the people who set education policy. You get to know the teachers and the administrators. You get to know the parents and students who care about quality schools. So you get to know everyone who influences the process. That's the upside of having a beat, is that if you cover education, so so in my case where I covered Congress. So you get to know the members of Congress, you get to know the members of their staff, so they know you. Okay, so that's the advantage of it. So you don't have to start from scratch every time, and you have someone who has some level of expertise in that particular subject matter. So given that scenario, what would be the downside of that? What would be bad about that? What would be the problem with it? Where can you see a problem with it? Or do you see a problem with it? So if my job is to cover education, and I cover education policy, the administrators, the laws, the parents, the students, the teachers, so the upside is, the advantage is, I get to know all those people. I'm an expert on what's being passed, on what's being considered. I know where it is in the process. I know all the ins and outs of it, so that when I go and cover a story, I'm already familiar with it. I don't have to start from scratch. That's the advantage of it. The downside of it is, and there is a downside, the downside is that you become such an expert sometimes that you forget that the people that who are in your audience don't know all the details that you do. Okay? So let's say you cover healthcare, and your beat is healthcare. So, and let's say you've been covering research into, or let's say you've been covering policy discussions about the introduction of a new drug to treat pneumonia. Okay. So you've been talking to doctors and to researchers and to policymakers and all these people. So you know this very well. And you start to describe these things to people in your writing, in your reporting, and in your, and so you understand the ins and outs of it, but they don't. So the downside of it is that beat reporters tend to learn the jargon, the language of a beat. And they tend to allow that to get into their reporting. And this is true when they use quotes. So your role as the journalist, as the storyteller, is to make sure when you quote somebody that they don't use language that's so difficult to understand that the people you are writing to won't know what they're talking about. So, and that's also true sometimes with abbreviations and acronyms and things like that. So, if we'll talk about procedures that in let's say a medical CAT scan. So in for many procedures now in the United States, they almost automatically give you a CAT scan. So everybody knows what a CAT scan is. We sort of take for granted everybody does. But if you are writing to an audience where that's not a common practice, and you know what it is and the people you're talking to know what it is, but your audience doesn't, then you need to explain to them what it is. So if you are quoting somebody who's talking about CAT scans, you can allow them to say what a CAT scan, that we're going to install new CAT scan equipment in the hospital. But if your audience is not likely to know what a CAT scan is, then you need to say a CAT scan is. And avoid allowing quotes into your stories that really are so complicated that people won't understand. So you want to make sure that again, it's about making sure that you move the story forward, and you're not going to move it forward if people don't understand. So if they're saying things if they're saying things that you understand, but that you know that your audience is not going to understand, what do you do? Before, when I said if the person isn't very well spoken, they're inarticulate, and you need the information, what do you do? What was the answer there? You paraphrase. Okay, so here's the other thing about quotes. So that you have to be very careful about. So especially with stories about controversial things, and it's one of those times where people have an opportunity to say something bad about someone or accuse someone of something or something like that. And you have to be very careful about allowing those kinds of quotes into your story. So let's say, you've seen somebody on the streets at this mugging, and you say, well, one of them got away. Okay, so that's fine. You've got a witness that you can put into your story that says one of them got away. And so, but if they go ahead and say, I'll bet it was Robert Naylor. Okay, that's accusatory. They don't know it for certain. You don't know it for certain, and you cannot use that as a quote. Or if they say, it has to be one of those people from that neighborhood. That's accusatory. So it's the sort of thing where it sort of blames someone without any way of backing it up, without any substantiation of it. They just blame someone. This happens a lot in politics. It happens a lot in stories where there's some sort of conflict between different people, where people are disagreeing about things. Where any time where people are disagreeing about things, there tends to be lots of times where people will accuse people of something and expect you to publish it. And don't do it. Do not publish what you can't say, no matter what. Avoid quotes that support stereotypes. All black people steal. Well, I didn't see who, I didn't see who did it, but I'll bet it was, whomever. Think of somebody. You avoid that because, it creates a stereotype about somebody. They all steal. They all commit crimes. They're always the ones who are doing it. And actually, I hear this sometimes in the United States. And particularly as it relates to certain ethnic groups about African Americans, about Mexicans, different groups from Latin America, they're always the ones doing this. And so you have to be very careful not to allow people to take advantage of your storytelling by advancing stereotypes. Now, here's an exception. If the police make an accusation, the police or the prosecutors, people involved in the criminal justice system, if they make an accusation in their official capacity, then you can use that as a quote. So just an ordinary person out saying it, then you don't. But if it's someone who is a police official or a public official or someone in a position of authority who you know has reason to know this, then they can make the accusation and you can quote them because as long as they are doing it in their official position. But even in those instances, do not allow them to use your story to advance stereotypes. And this is one of the things that we see in a lot of American cities now, whereas there's a lot of conflict between African Americans and police, where police unions, not so much the police force, but the unions that represent the police officers are really try to advance it, and they'll stand up and say things, and that really advance stereotypes about different groups of people. And that's one of the things that you don't want to do. Avoid quotes that do not directly relate to the focus of your story. So we talked about the focus and gaining focus in your story. That was one of the things we talked about earlier in the week. If the quote doesn't relate to the focus of your story, leave it out. So what I'm going to do is just kind of a simple exercise just about how to structure a quote. And I've written on the board. So here's the thing. So when we write a quote, we use quotation marks, and we close it with quotation marks. And so in my first one, there are no exceptions to that rule. So I have a comma here. So I start with quotes. There are no exceptions to that rule, the professor said. I start my quote. I have a comma here. I have my quote here. So that is hard, and that's a rule. One of the difficult times, a lot of journalists have problems with this, is how do I quote someone who's asking a question? Okay, so the answer is, and it's just a structure thing. It's not so the answer is the question part of the sentence that you are writing is your sentence a question, or are you quoting simply the question? So in the first instance here, he asked, when does the class end? So, and the question mark is here and then the quotes, because that's what this is the sentence. This is the whole, when does the class end? And then in the second instance, who said, I hope it ends by 7:30? You put the quote and then the question mark. Every time you quote a new speaker, start a new paragraph. And do not attribute a quote more than once. So if you've got, so if you say, if you're quoting me in your story, and I say something, and then I say something, you don't have to go through this whole process. As long as you are continuing to quote me, you only quote me the one time. The other thing is when you are quoting people, you always want to attribute it. You always want to attribute it. And here's the one thing about using any sources for your story. So, and this is one of the things we always dealt with at the Associated Press. When I talked about being skeptical. Part of your role as a journalist is to be skeptical. So when someone tells you something, your role as a journalist, as a storyteller, is to understand, how do they know this? How do they know this? So if someone tells you that there was another person, but one got away. So you don't want to insult people. So you don't say, well, how do you know? But you do need to ascertain how they know this. Did they see this person? What did the person look like? But you want to approach it with a sense of skepticism, so that you verify from people how they know something. So if someone tells you, if you're writing a story again about a healthcare story, and the senior administrator at the hospital says, we're buying new CAT scan equipment, that's an authoritative source. That's someone who is in a position to know, because he's buying the equipment. So there's no need for you to do that. But in an instance where you are uncertain, you cannot be certain of whether the source who has told you something is true, then what should you do? If you've asked this person on the street corner, So a person on the street corner has said, there was another person and he got away. And so you ask a few questions. So you don't say, oh, okay, which way did he go? What did he look like? So you've walked away with this saying, I've got someone saying that there was another person who got away. But you don't feel comfortable reporting that until you can, find out some more information. What do? So if you are not comfortable, but that I want to be sure that there was another person. You want to know, did anyone else see? So you ask other people on the street. You investigate more. And that's true with most stories. If you have done reporting on a story and you feel, I think this information is credible, but I don't feel strong enough about it to report it until I can verify it more, you investigate further. And that's a lot of what reporters do. You do that a lot of the times. And even sometimes when it's sources that you know. Sometimes you are even comfortable with the information that you get, but you feel like, I need to investigate more. I need to find out more about it. I need to find out someone else who can tell me different elements about it. Because sometimes a source can tell you something that is good information, that is quality information, but they don't know the whole story. And so you do more investigation to find out, what are the other pieces that are missing here? There are other things that I need to tell my audience that I don't know, and so I have to go out and investigate more to figure out what that is. So I'll bring this to class Monday in a handout. It is 7:19, so I want to finish up and get you out here at a decent hour, especially since it's Friday night. But I just want to run through something very quickly with with pitching your story. So here's the thing. I really have this belief that every journalist gets into journalism for a particular reason. There's something that makes us want to tell these stories. Okay, so there's a reason that we want to engage an audience. There's a reason that we want to reach over here and find out something and then tell other people about it. There's something about us, something that's happened in our lives, something we've been touched by. But there's another piece of that. The other thing is that everybody has a kind of story that they like to tell. Now, so I grew up in Mississippi, I said, in the South of the United States. Mississippi was the place, for any of you who know anything about the civil rights struggle in America, this was the most difficult part of America for black folks to live. It was the most onerous, the most difficult, the most racist, the most segregated part of the United States of America, where I grew up. And so when I became a journalist, much the way that all of you talk about wanting to tell the narrative about Ethiopia and about Africa, I wanted to tell the stories about people like me who had grown up under these systems. But I wanted to do it from a standpoint of, and I became a writer who covered primarily politics. Most of my career when I was a writer, I covered politics or government of one kind or another. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to cover politics and government, but I wanted to talk about it from the standpoint of the human condition and how government affects people. And not simply talk about the legislature passed this law, but the legislature passed this law and here's what it means to you. Here's how it affects your life. Okay? So all of you, I ask you to think about a story that you would pitch so that you can make your story pitch. But now I want to ask you, because I think this is important in pitching your stories as you go along, what kind of stories do you want to tell? And I just want to get a couple of people to talk about that. It doesn't have to be, what kind of stories, someone who feels comfortable talking about it. And it may be that you're even still thinking about it, and if you are, that's fine. But I just want to get, because we don't have a lot of time, what kind of stories do you want to tell? So lots of things make people hurt. So here's what I would say to you. When you take a big topic like that, you need to figure out, what am I going to focus on? Because there are some stories that are simply too big for you to tell. There's so much that you just can't tell it. So that's something that you want to think about. What makes people hurt? Why do people hurt? Why do people hurt? So what I would suggest to you is that while you're thinking about that, start to focus on particular aspects of the hurt. So not only, so that your first question, I would think, is not, so if I were working with you as an editor, I would say, the first question you have to ask yourself is not why people hurt, but what makes them hurt. Okay? So once you start to figure out what makes them hurt, then you can look more closely at why they hurt. Does that make sense? I think that's a very good thing to do, though, because if you are looking at that, there are a lot of aspects of those kinds of stories that you can tell because they go into all kinds of arenas. But they are stories that touch people's lives, and you'll get to interact with people in a lot of ways. I think that's really good. Okay, thank you.